Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Extraordinary Leader Program. We're thrilled to see all of you, lots of familiar faces in our regular program, and then I see some special guests with us, so we're thrilled to have you as well. For those of you that I don't know, I'm Shelley McDougall, and I'm calling in from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Kevin McDougall is with Kevin McDonald. Is with me over in the Vancouver area. Kevin, hello. And I was just looking at messages at the same time I'm speaking. So, anyways, welcome everyone. This is the time in our Extraordinary Leader program where each month we bring in someone from the outside to join us in a conversation around leadership, most often in connection with the topic we've been talking about. This month we're talking about standards and extraordinary standards. And so we're excited to bring in Brian Gora with us to have this conversation. Just a couple of things, everyone. For those of you that are guests with us, our call today is 1 hour in length, and we will be making sure. So we'll be in conversation, Kevin and I, with Brian over the next 45 minutes or so, and then we'll make sure that you have time. So please, you might jot down some notes, some ideas, some thoughts, and you get to ask Brian a question at the end of the call. So we'll be opening up the lines then. Until we do that, though, we ask that you can please make sure that you are on mute. That would help for our audio recording. And if you have any questions, you can certainly jump into the chat area, write those down. You can also put any remarks or anything that you're hearing in there as well. And then we look forward to connecting with you, of course, at the top, near the top of the next hour. So sit back, relax. Maybe you're taking notes. Get ready. I know this is going to be an amazing call. So go ahead. Go ahead, Kevin.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming today, and we are very excited to have Brian Gora with us today. He is somebody that I got to meet this year. Well, I got to meet him last year, but I got to really get to know him this year as I was at the event for Teed Up for the Troops in at Reunion in Orlando. And Brian was my roommate, and my first night there, I thought I'd get to bed around 8 o'clock and have a nice long sleep to get ready for the next day. And I think we were up at 1:30, still talking, fascinating conversation. And we are so excited that we get to have him present to you today. So um, I think most people have read the bio that we sent out about Brian, but I guess Brian, from Shelley and me and everybody at the Extraordinary Leader Program, thank you, thank you, thank you for coming and giving some of your time to us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited and it's my pleasure to be here.
Well, so Brian, maybe for people who didn't get all of your bio, I wonder if you could just tell a few people about what you've been doing in your adult life and just sort of bring us up to speed and giving people an idea of some of the background and experience you have.
Certainly. I'll keep this part pretty quick. I'm not a big fan of talking about myself too much, but I'm originally from Chicago, so wherever Jacqueline or Jacqueline, depending on how we want to pronounce it today. My hometown there. But my dad worked for the railroad, so we moved around a little bit. And I've actually moved a lot. The last move I made in Minnesota was the 29th move I've made since I was a kid. So I get around a little bit, either A or B. I can't seem to stay in one spot. I'm not sure what my problem is. But anyway, I decided at a young age I wanted to be a pilot. So I went to the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks to the John D. Odegaard Center for Aerospace Sciences. You've never heard of it. It is one of the premier aviation schools in the country. You may have heard of a place called Embry-Riddle, very similar to Embry-Riddle. In fact, UND and Embry-Riddle kind of compete against each other quite a bit. And so I wanted to be a pilot, went there to learn to fly. When I got there, I ended up applying for and receiving a scholarship through the United States military. So I ended up after college going into the Army. The funny part about it was I had as a part of this scholarship what was called a guaranteed aviation option. So I knew I was going to fly in the military. But when I got to the Army, I actually had all of my ratings in fixed wing helicopter and even a business jet type rating. So I was pretty well equipped when I got there. I actually went in as an armor officer to Fort Knox, Kentucky, where I rode around in tanks for a while. Which, if you've ever seen a tank, nothing about a tank is soft, or in fact, everything about it wants to bruise you or break something. So it was fun. But then I went to Fort Rucker, Alabama, and went through the flight training. Came out of there with as an AH-1 Cobra pilot, which was the attack helicopter that preceded the Apache. So if you've ever seen any stuff on TV, it was a gunship that came actually from the Vietnam era, and we had it for a while till we had the Apache. I was in the Army for a while. I was sort of an in-betweener. I came in right after Vietnam, and I left before the whole global war on terror. But while I was in, I ended up down being deployed into Central America multiple times and was part of Operation Just Cause down in Panama, which funny enough, maybe they'll call me to go back down and help them out if we decide to take it back. Who knows? No pun intended there. But anyway, so after I left the service, and I enjoyed the service, it was a great time. There's nothing cool or fun about combat. It is what it is, but the camaraderie and the great things. And I'll talk a little bit about that today and some of the standards that I learned from the military. I stayed in the aerospace industry for quite a while, about almost 25 years after I got out, working for different companies that supplied product to all the big airframers, so Boeing, Airbus, all the business jet guys, Bombardier, folks like that, as well as helicopter and the DoD guys direct. I did that. It was a public company, and I stayed with them until we had an acquisition when I left. And then I did some private work. I was a consultant. I was a Vistage coach for a while, for those who know Vistage, which I believe was actually founded in Canada and transferred to the United States. And so I did that for a little bit. I actually then ended up as a CEO of a medical services company. One of my clients actually hired me. And then I also was the COO of a electronics company. So I ran some pretty large organizations from about 50 million up to over $1 billion in revenue with all international, lots of folks. And after all that was done, I actually bought a business, sold it to one of my customers, and then retired, only to join Teed Up for the Troops, a military veteran service organization that supports veterans and their families by raising awareness and funds through primarily golf, but other things. And then I unretired back in November of 23 to take a full-time job with Tee It Up. One of my bucket list items was to work for a veteran nonprofit when I got out of business. And so I'm actually being able to do that, which is pretty cool. So that's me in a nutshell.
Okay, well, thank you, Brian. And so, as you know, we're here to talk about standards, both personal and professional standards. But can you talk about some of the standards that have served you in your life? And as you mentioned, some come from the military, and some come from business, and a lot of personal ones. Can you talk a little bit about standards?
Yeah, sure. Just for personal side, as a kid, I my parents always told me do the best you can, and they said you're capable of doing a lot, so don't ever sacrifice and take a shortcut or take the easy way out. Challenge yourself to be the best that you can be. Not to take a slogan from the army, but so it started when I was young, and I kind of always pushed myself to do that because I believed and they reinforced that I was capable of doing more. The military is all about standards, right? Standard operating procedures is the way the military works. And in the business world, we refer to that as standard work or sort of that kind of vernacular. So the military is very, very structured. It sets very high standards because of the mission that you're asked to do that at some point you may be put in harm's way. And so you need to be ready. I think one of the things I learned in the military is you prepare every day as if it's real. So that when it is real, it's not so shocking to you. So we trained hard, we flew hard, we flew dangerously because we needed to be prepared for that. And I would say in business, sometimes we're not necessarily think about it the same way, where we just sort of get through it maybe at times, and yet every day is the real deal. And so I always tried to look at it that way. I think in business was interesting for me after coming out of the military with a lot of structure. Business is all about process. If you put good process and good structure and have high standards to follow process, great things will happen. And I'll tell you a story about that I learned in business. And so became a bit of a student of Japanese. We pushed a lot of continuous improvement, lean concepts, those kind of things. And the Japanese were asked when they first started to tell the rest of the world about their approach. And someone said to at the time, one of the chairman of Toyota Corporation, and said, "Why aren't you afraid that the rest of the world's going to catch up?" And he said, "Actually, not." He said, "In Japan, we have average people in achieving incredible results through perfect process. And everything we do is about process." He said, "When something goes wrong, we don't ask who done it. That's what the Western world does. We ask, do we have a process? Is it written down? Do we follow it? And if the answer to that is no, then there's a process breakdown. We're not going to blame the people." The Western world, on the other hand, looks to have great people because their process is so poor and often get mediocre results in spite of the great folks. And so I share that just to say that I became a huge student of process thinking because, especially in aerospace and manufacturing, process is everything in terms of quality and repeatability, and that's where you get efficiency. And I would argue for any of you on the phone that if you look at what you do and ask yourself, what do we do pretty much the same all the time? There should be a very rigorous process and even standard work, i.e., it's written down so everybody knows, and we follow it all the time. And you'd be amazed how much efficiency you'll get just by doing things the same way every time.
The personal standards, Brian, like how did you develop yours?
So, Kevin and I chatted a little bit about this before. You know, when I was younger, I was a little more intense. So this is the calmer, gentler version of me. But I always push myself to very high standards and challenge myself to, as I said, my parents were like, "You could do better, you could do better." So I carried that through my life. And in business and in the military, that works to some degree. But at some point, you have to be careful that you don't outpace your organization by having your standards so high that folks are sort of not keeping up because it's maybe a little bit excessive. So you got to set high standards for yourself, but don't make it sort of push that on others. Have realistic standards, but also challenging standards that are achievable. You know, it's been said that if the expectations are too high, some folks will just give up before they even get started because it doesn't feel achievable. So there has to be an achievable component in there, right? Because if it's not, you know, you talk about SMART objectives, if you've ever heard that phrase, right? And then the A is achievable, which is that we can actually do it. Now, it might be a stretch, but it's got to be something that's achievable. I think the other thing for me, and this came from the military for sure, but it's, you know, be on time. And that's, you know, another way to say that is meet your commitment, right? It's surprising to me how many folks struggle with that concept. And in the military, you know, especially when we were in combat, but even as we were training, if you had a time on target to service a target and support the people on the ground or whatever, if you were off by seconds, bad things happen. So in business, I struggled when folks would say, "Well, we're going to be late." And I'll say, "Well, how late are we going to be?" "Well, we're going to be months late." I say, "Well, months late." In fact, there was a great quote by the chairman of Boeing Aircraft Company years ago. He was talking with his projects managers, and he said, "What's the status of the program?" And the gentleman answered and said, "Well, we're a little behind. You know, I think about 4 or 5 months we should be caught up." And the chairman of Boeing looked at him and he said, "You're looking at your calendar. I'm looking at my watch." And I always remembered that quote because, again, you know, there's time is our most precious commodity, personally and organizationally and in business and whatever it is we do. And so we got to take that seriously. So be on time, do what you say, meet your commitments is so very important. And I'll tell you that a lot of times folks would say to me, I was the president of $1 billion company. People say, "How do I get your job, Brian? How do I be you?" And I said, "That's really the wrong question. Better question is how do you do my job once you get it?" And what I did was every position I was given, I first of all, you know, when they'd ask me like a good soldier, I'd say, "Yes, I'll take the next position." But I never looked for it. I was never pushing myself to get the next one. I was never looking for the raise because I believe that my standard was do the very best in the position you have, give it the best you can every day. The next job will come, the promotion will come, and the money will follow. If you're chasing jobs and money, more than likely the runway's a little short. That's my 2 cents.
Wow. Okay. Um, personally, are you a father? Are you a husband? Or tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so husband and father. My bride and I, Sandy, have 5 kids, and we have 7 grandchildren. In fact, I could get a text at any moment for number 8.
Oh,
Our son and his
congratulations.
wife are expecting momentarily. So yes, and we have a dog named Louie who takes as much time as the kids for sure.
What would your kids say about your standards? What would they have learned from you?
You know, again, the before the kindler, gentler me, they might have said I pushed them a little bit hard, like I not in a bad way, but just challenged them to do as good as you can, and you know, and you want your kids to be successful. You want them to have all that they want. Sometimes they approach it differently,
Mhm.
and they're all different. So and we have quite a mix. So I would say that they would see me as challenging them to do the best they can, but also supporting them. As I went on in business, and we may talk about this later, but I learned a very valuable lesson, especially as a leader. And the larger the business got, the more this was sort of more obvious to me. But leader in as a leadership position, how many folks here would consider themselves in a leadership position of some sort? Raise your hand if that applies to you.
I
So
would
so
hope
few,
everybody.
right? Well, the truth is, you're all leaders, right? At some level, no matter where you are in the organization, you're a leader either of your group or of the project or the things that you might be touching. And here's the thing about leadership, and this may disappoint you when I say this: it is not about you. Okay, it is absolutely not about you as a leader. It is about your team because they do all the work. Okay, now you may feel like you're that person now, and I'll give you an analogy to prove my point here. And this applies to your children. So now I think about this, right? And supporting your team and helping your team get better. And I like to say, equip and enable your folks to do their very best and then get out of the way, right? So I've tried to take a slightly different approach with the kids and encourage them to do what they want and support them in doing that. But here's the analogy, and I'll shift gears for just a second. But I love this one. So whether you're a football fan or not, but even if it's hockey or some other sport, professional sport, right? So a lot of times the coach who's on the field or the manager to it's baseball, depending on what they call them, right, is a former athlete almost all the time. Right? They played that sport typically, right? So when the game is on the line, so let's just say there was a hockey game last night, and the game, sadly, at least I got to see 3 Stanley Cups with the Chicago Blackhawks because lately they're not very good. But let's just say that the Chicago Blackhawks are playing somebody last night, and things are not going well. Okay, and at any point, have you ever seen the coach run in the locker room, suit up, and skate out on the ice? Anybody ever seen that? Raise your hand. Anybody seen that happen? Pro hockey. Why is that? Why is that the case? Aside from they're old and they probably get hurt, but why are they not skating out on the ice? It's not their job,
Not their
right?
focus.
What's the job of the coach? The job of the coach, in spite of the fact they may have been a great player, okay, is to achieve success through other people. That's what leadership is. So it isn't about you. So I'll ask you this: when you run into problems at your position in your organization, wherever you work, whatever you're responsible for, the team you're working on, when things go bad, do you have a tendency to want to jump in personally and take over and start fixing it? Because I've seen it in business all the time. And the question is, why are you doing that? Because you're not supposed to be playing anymore. You're supposed to be leading and helping others achieve. So my standard became leadership and how important it is. And in fact, I launched a leadership academy to help teach the concepts of leadership and achieving success through other people. And that's just really, really important to me. And so hopefully my kids see a little bit of that where I'm trying to help them achieve success and not impose my will on what they're up to.
Are you kinder and gentler with your grandchildren, or are you less pushy, or do you, is it similar?
It's actually a little similar because I want to see that we have a couple of older grandkids who are very athletic, and I'm like, okay, now don't mess it up by doing something dumb off the court that ruins your chances on the court because you've got talent and skill. So think that through. I'm still that voice of reason that probably they don't want to hear, but just to remind them that it can go sideways pretty quick, and all that you've worked for can be over. So don't let that happen to you.
All right. Okay. Well, I got to experience your leadership at Tee It Up for the Troops. I know what you're like. And you're very kind and supportive. That's for sure. Hey, some of the organizations you work for, if you can think back, whether it's the military or the ones that you led, what were some of the standards that set them apart? Like, can you think back to that?
Yeah, obviously the military, it's set apart in the sense that it has the standards, but it has to, right? Because if you don't do that, and I'll tell you one thing about the military is people think you just order people around, right? You just tell people what to do and they do it. And trust me when I tell you that doesn't work very well at all, right? You still have to, it's still all the things we talk about today that we didn't used to talk about emotional intelligence and leadership and persuasion and encouragement. You still have to do it because you're asking folks to do some really tough and maybe bad stuff, right? So it's not just ordering things around, but the standards, the standard operating procedures, and all the stuff that we did help. Because then when things start to go sideways, and they will, you know what folks are going to do. You know you can expect them to do certain things certain ways. Doesn't mean that you don't have to change what you're doing in the face of difficulty. But it did help a lot. But I'll tell you one example. So I work for an organization, and has anybody heard of the Danaher operating system? This goes back in time a little bit. It was a company out of, I think, Michigan. They were in the automotive industry, and they created this thing called the operating system, which is the basis upon which their organization functioned. Well, the company that I worked for was an aerospace company, and we created our own operating system, and it had three components. The first component was continuous improvement. And we lived and breathed continuous improvement as a solution to all our problems because the tool sets of Lean and Six Sigma and those kind of things work. And so if you have a problem, rather than sit around and brainstorm what you might try, apply the tools, and more than likely you'll solve the problem. So continuous improvement was a huge component of what we did. That was one element of our operating system. And we had very high standards. We trained people on it. And we expect it even at the leader level. In fact, I took over a business, the last business that I ran that we grew to $1.2 billion over 4 years. And I had every single leader go through 2 weeks of training on continuous improvement. And I actually had a few come to see me and they said, Brian, I don't think I need to do this. I don't understand why you want to do this. I said, because I'm not going to expect the people in the organization to do something that you've not done yourself. So I want you to learn it and talk it and know the vocabulary. And that way, and I want you to lead it. I want you to be out there doing it, not just telling other people what to do. So continuous improvement was a huge component of it and very high standard of implementation of execution. So much so that when we would do a review, like a monthly review or a review at even the corporate level with the chairman, we would use our continuous improvement tools. One of those is called Hoshin planning, which is a Japanese term, and the American version of that's called policy deployment. Basically, what it means is you take your objectives, and I'll ask how many of you do this, and you actually deploy them down to the lowest level of the organization, right? And I'll give you an example. So let's say our goal is to grow sales by 20%. Okay, big goal, big lofty goal. Want to grow revenues by 20% through sales. If you were going to deploy that down to the front desk receptionist, if you had one at your organization, right? What kind of a goal could you give that person that would help sales, right? So what we did was we looked at every single position and we went down. We said, okay, if that front desk receptionist, let's say, answers every phone call within 2 rings, right, or 3 rings or whatever, something like that, then the probability is that that person is going to get served, right, versus having to leave a message. And I don't know if you know this, but for most organizations, when they're looking for someone to do work with, the one they choose is often the company that either answers the phone or calls them back first. So a little bit of trivia for you there, but it's actually a true fact. So if you ask your receptionist to answer the phone on 3 rings or less every single time and be pleasant and welcome that person and thank them for calling, does that help sales, do you think? Absolutely, it does. In contrast, if they don't answer the phone or they're not very happy or pleasant when they do, does that affect sales, do you think? Absolutely. So the expectation is that you set objectives and hold people accountable. And accountability is such a scary word, right? The truth is it's not, right? It's just we expect you to do the job that needs to be done. And I'll give you an analogy in just a second. So that was the second component, was deploy these objectives to every person in the organization. So when you come in, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, you know that if I do these things, that's going to help the organization achieve its objectives, right? And we were pretty rigorous about that. So that was a very, very high standard. The third one, and probably the most important, was the one we called the people philosophy. And in our organization, we didn't have policies. We didn't have rules because we found that policies and rules are written for the 5% that don't comply with expectations. We had guidelines for the 95% who came there to do a good job. And then we dealt with those that didn't want to comply one-on-one separately. And the question we asked them was very simple. Are you willing, because it's always a willing and able thing, are you willing to make the changes to help us succeed? And it's a simple, it's a binary question. There's no kind of, sort of, maybe, right? In the words of the great philosopher Yoda, right? There's do or do not. There is no try. So it was a simple question. Are you willing to make the changes necessary for us to be successful? If the answer is yes, great. We're going to help you get there. If the answer is no, then maybe we'll help you go somewhere else. So the other piece of the philosophy is this adult to adult concept of the way we talk to each other, right? And sadly, in business, you see this doesn't happen all the time. But when we're working through things, we talk about it as adults. We ask questions, we listen. But more importantly, because we're so process focused, we never point fingers when things go wrong at people. We don't run around saying who done it, who's at fault, who was the last person to touch that. We don't do that kind of stuff. And you see this all the time. I'm sure you see it in your organizations. You see it in other organizations all the time. When things go bad, we start pointing fingers and say who screwed up. We didn't do that. We said, where did the process break down, or where did we fail as leaders to properly equip and enable folks to be their very best? And we fixed that, right? And I can't tell you how powerful that was. The other piece of our people's philosophy was health and wellness. We had shutdown days every year where we shut the whole plant down. I had 4,000 people worldwide in my organization. We shut everything down and we did classes on diet, classes on fitness, brought in fitness trainers, did 5Ks and 10Ks and bike rides and volleyball and different things, just to help folks have a better health and wellness. And we did a bunch of other things with online medical support and things like that. So 3 key components set the organization apart: continuous improvement, the policy deployment, setting objectives at every person in the organization so they could see how they fit into what we were trying to do, and the people philosophy, adult to adult behavior, set guidelines, not policies, because most of the people want to do a great job, and let's equip and enable them to be the best they can be. Sorry, I probably talked too long.
No, that was fantastic. I really appreciate that. Shelley, how good is that? I I think my next question you might have just answered, but I was going to ask you about how do you set, teach, and uphold standards? And that, I think for some people, maybe the uphold standards, sometimes is difficult. How did you overcome any difficulties with upholding standards or teaching your people how to uphold standards?
Yeah, great question. And my answer is, how do you do it? It depends a little bit on. So I was asked to do a couple of turnaround situations when I lived in Europe for a while as an expat in the UK, and we had a business that we acquired that was underperforming pretty significantly. So in that case, the first expectation was just to get out of the hole. So it was less long term and much more short term because we were losing money and had unhappy customers and product failing and all that kind of bad stuff. So that in that case, it was less about, here's the standard was, we got to meet our commitments. We got to figure out what's wrong and fix it very quickly. Once we did that, then we would get into a mode of long-term, expectations to keep it that way. But turnarounds are a little different animal. If you're in a stable organization or even an organization that wants to grow, then it's a slightly different approach. And I would say the first thing is, again, setting standards is simply, what are the expectations? Again, we come to work on time. We were talking about this the other day in a meeting, but meetings start on time, right? When the meeting was supposed to start, I would close the door. And if you had to knock, then that would, sort of a self identification there, whatever. And if you didn't come in at all, then we'd chat afterwards. But it wasn't mean. It was just meetings start on time. That's an expectation. And so it sounds a bit draconian. It's not intended to be. But and again, stuff happens. We get that. We don't beat people up. But if we can't start on time, we're never going to get anything done. So that's really important. But so I think it's just setting those expectations of what the organization needs. And I'll tell you, one of the things I learned over many years of doing this is explain why. If you want to grow sales 20%, why are we doing that? What is the reasoning for that? Is it our market position? Is it a new product that we have? It's not just so we can make more money, although that might be the driver, but at least explain why to folks. They don't have to like it, but at least they'll understand it. If you never say why, people just feel like it's kind of rammed down their throat a little bit, that this is what we're doing and too bad. So I would always spend some time explaining why we were doing what we were doing and the strategy and the objectives and the goals that we had. And then probably the most powerful tool that we had were metrics, right? Or measurements. And I'm not sure what word everybody's uses, but the metrics, the dashboards, the things that we track. The old saying, what gets measured is what gets done. But I'm going to share something with you that's going to probably freak you out a little bit, because of how we approached it was the opposite of the way you would think. But metrics, so think about flying an airplane. Okay, if you ever looked in the cockpit of an aircraft, there's gauges and dials and stuff all over the place. And you might say to yourself, how in the world do you fly looking at all that stuff? Well, here's the bad news. If you're a passenger, you don't look at all that stuff all the time. You look at the gauges to tell you there's a problem. So the metrics, the gauges in the cockpit of an airplane, and the metrics, the dashboard in your business or your organization, exists solely to tell you when something's wrong. Okay? So use those metrics to identify shortcomings and then address the process to deliver different outcomes. One of the things that's really important to me, and this became later in life a standard, is what are we doing about the problem? And most of the time when you ask that question, especially in a turnaround, you'll get well, we had meetings, we're looking at it, we've got a committee, evaluating. None of that's doing, right? That I'm doing means we're actually physically changing something to get a different outcome. Okay. So doing things is so critical. So therefore, if our metrics are telling us there's an issue, we don't talk about it, we don't blame, we don't wring our hands, we take action, we change some dynamic to get a different outcome. All right. So the metrics are so critical. Here's the weird part that will freak you out a little bit. Great story of this. I'll illustrate this in a second. So we had this saying called "embrace the red." So if the metrics were green, we weren't interested. We only wanted to know the metrics that were red. Why? And we only had red and green. There was no yellow. Because yellow, what do you do with yellow? Like you watch it till it gets better. Guess what? Bad news does not get better with age. I call it the dead fish syndrome, right? You ask somebody, why is this bad? And they'll say, well, and then I say, well, how long has it been this way? Oh, months. By the time I see it, it's a dead fish. There's nothing I can do with it. I couldn't save it, right? So we want to see red and green, good, bad. Doesn't mean you're behind. It just means that there's a problem. And now you know where to look. So we actually embraced the red. We celebrated the red. If everything was green, there was nothing to celebrate. In fact, we'd make the metrics higher or more challenging so we could push the organization to break something so we knew what to work on. And I can tell you that there's actually, when I was a Vista chair, we brought in a speaker and he did a great job. And he said, everybody's afraid of accountability because they said, oh, you're gonna be mad at me. You're going to yell at me. You're going to whatever. No. In fact, the most powerful tool for accountability is transparency. And that's what metrics do because then you're not hiding from it, right? And everybody embraces the metric. It's not Shelly's problem or Kevin's problem or Jacqueline's problem. It's our problem. So when we look at the metrics, we see the problem, and now we're all accountable to do something different to get a different outcome. So holding people accountable actually is easier because we're all talking about the problems together. We're not in a dark room somewhere. I'll tell you a great story about this to illustrate my point. So anybody know who Alan Mulally is? Ever heard that name? A few of you, I see Kevin nodding his head. So Alan goes back a little ways. Alan was the chairman of Boeing Commercial Aircraft for a number of years out of Seattle. And he left Boeing and took the job as CEO of Ford Motor Company right before the 2008-2009 collapse. And it was interesting, in his opening press conference in Detroit, several reporters were there, and they said, Mr. Mulally, we're curious why you think you can take over Ford and actually know something about the auto industry. You were in aerospace. And, the cars, there's millions of cars, and every one of them has like 2,000 parts that all have to work together. And so how are you gonna manage that? He said, well, actually, airplanes have about 2 million parts that have to work together and they have to fly. So I think I'll be just fine taking care of automotive. But he told a story that when he took over at Detroit, he brought in all his VPs from all around the world, and both Alan was I got the opportunity to brief Alan when our landing gear were late over and over again. That wasn't pleasant. But he was a very metric driven guy. He had a lot of PowerPoint slides, and he wanted to see the metrics. So his team came from all over the world to Detroit. He had vice presidents of all the different regions of the world and all the different models and all the different types of products that they offered. They all came together in this huge boardroom in Detroit for the first meeting with the brand new CEO. And they started going through their dashboards. Now, one little piece of information, at this time, Ford was losing $1 billion a quarter. That's with a B, okay? So they come in, and the first person gets up, and they start presenting the slides, and all the slides are green. Next person gets up, and the metrics are green. Third person gets up, the metrics are green. And Alan says, all right, time out. Unless something changed in the last 5 minutes, we're losing $1 billion a quarter. How in the world can all the metrics be green? I'm confused. He says, I tell you what, rather than pick on anybody here, here's what we're going to do. We're going to stop the meeting right now. I want you to go away. I want you to come back in a week and bring the real metrics about what's really going on, because we can't fix what we can't see. So they come back, and of course, you know how the story ends. They come in, every single thing is red. You're losing $1 billion a quarter. How can it not be? But I tell you that story that, again, people are so afraid of the red that they actually change the metrics to make them green, and green doesn't help. So from a standards and expectations perspective, set high standards, work together, and then to hold people accountable isn't as scary because we're all working on it together. So it may sound a little wacky, but that's how we did it. And I'll tell you, we were able to accomplish some pretty incredible things doing it that way. One quick story. 2008 financial crisis hits. At the time, there were 3,000 people in the organization. Everybody and everywhere were laying people off by the thousands, right? I mean, you couldn't get a job at the library back then. I'm sitting in a library, but it was terrible, right? And I got my team together and I said, we're not going to lay anybody off. I said, we're going to find cost cutting. We're going to do everything we can. And I don't want to lay anybody off because I think we can get through this together without that. Long story short, I had a union facility in Union, West Virginia, of all places, where they wouldn't let me move people around to the places where we had to work. So I had to lay 30 people off out of 3,000. That's it. We hired them back within 30 days. And at the end of the year on flat sales, we grew margins because we took 40 million in cost out. But that wasn't because of one person or anybody else. It was because the team using the tools, being accountable, looking at cash flow and where we had problems, worked together to solve it. And we were able to accomplish that. And that's probably the thing I'm most proud of, not the billions of dollars that we had in revenue or the profit that we made, but we didn't lay anybody off. And imagine the number of resumes we got coming out of that because we needed dump trucks to deliver them. So
Wow, I love that. Brian, I do have to let you hear Shelley's voice soon, but I'm going to ask one more question, Shell. It's just, you are a student of leadership, and you alluded to the fact you had a leadership program or a leadership institute that you created. We have some young leaders on the call here today. If you look back and you think about starting out and what you've learned, what advice would you give to young leaders that are at the beginning of their career?
yeah, great question. And I'm very, very passionate about leadership. Leadership is hard work, right? Because again, you're achieving success through others, and that's the hardest thing in the world to do. So remember, it's not about you. Surround yourself with the best people you can have, hopefully people smarter than you, and give them what they need to be successful and then get out of their way. They will amaze you. So that's lesson number one. Folks will amaze you if you let them do what they do. Micromanagement is the worst thing you can do. So if you do that or you see that, that's the last thing is guide, direct, and let people do things. They'll be fabulous. One of the things I learned about flying, and this applies to business as well, is the leader. You have to be what I call up and out, not down and in. So don't be staring at your feet. Don't be looking at the problems right in front of you. As the leader, you need to be out in front of your organization. You need to be looking at some leading indicators, economic or otherwise, about what's happening so that you don't get surprised. Because if you're not doing it, I got bad news for you. Nobody is. So somebody's got to be looking out. In an airplane, if you're staring at the instruments, you'll end up boring a hole in the ground. So you have to look outside, even when you're flying in the clouds. You look at the instruments, but you got to get that orientation, if you will. So don't just be staring down. Look up and out. Look out in front of your organization to the best of your ability, depending on your level. Don't just worry about what's in front of you. One other thing I mentioned about why already, but one of the things that I learned a long time ago is when you're asking people about, we're talking about accomplishments, goals, objectives, and we say here let's achieve this or let's do this. A lot of times we'll say, what do you think you can do? And when we ask the question that way, our brain immediately goes to the negative because we don't want to be embarrassed or disappoint. So we hedge a little bit in our response and say, well, I think I can do this. I'll give you an example in a second. What I learned is don't ask that question. Ask the question, what will it take to achieve this? Immediately, the brain goes to positive thinking about possibilities as opposed to the negative of, I don't want to be embarrassed. And you have a much better dialogue. Here's the example. Let's say that I told everybody on the call, by the end of this year, together, we're going to all complete a marathon. Okay. How many marathon runners do we have in the group? Anybody? Yeah, definitely not me. Far from it. But we want to complete a marathon by the end of the year. So if I said, what can you do? The reaction I would get would probably a mix of, well, I can run about a block. That's me. I can run maybe a couple miles, maybe a 5K or whatever, right? But if I said to you, what would it take to complete? I didn't say run, but complete a marathon by the end of the year. Your brain immediately goes to, okay, well, maybe if I started out by running a little bit, or I got some new shoes, or we started to do some training, we got 11 months, we start today, a little bit each week, a little bit each month. Yeah, maybe we could do it. Doesn't mean we will. But do you see how your brain, and hopefully your brain went there and you don't think I'm nuts, but seriously, what will it take is a much better question to ask your team, especially for challenging goals, than what can you do? Because that starts to limit our thinking.
That Shelley, what are you
Wow.
hearing?
Well, first I just want to say, wow, fantastic, Brian. Um, okay, I have a whole bunch of questions, but the first thing comes to mind just when you say that, I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit, Brian, about how do you get the next level on board? So if you're the CEO or the head of the organization, you got that next level of your senior leaders. How do you get them on board with developing the standards versus you telling them? So got a whole bunch of leaders in the room, every level today in our room. Some are beginning out supervisors, others are at the top of their organization. And we often talk about, and you said you can't micromanage, you can't tell. So how do you get that next level really to get the buy-in so that then they can take it from there? What do you do?
Yeah, great question. I think it starts with, first of all, if surround yourself with great people. And a question I would ask folks when I would go into an organization and say, "Oh, we're really struggling," or "I'm having trouble with this person or that person," I'd say, if you knew somebody that you could put in that position and would dramatically change the organization, how would that make you feel? And they go, "Oh, it'd be great." I go, "Okay, well now you know what the problem is." So I'm not saying you run around getting rid of folks, but you also have to have the best and the brightest you can. Otherwise, you are going to have to drive the ship, and that's because again, if you're doing that, who's doing your job? So first, to the best of your ability, get the best people that you can, and then find out what they need to be successful. Ask them so they all know what the goals are. They know what the standards are. Those usually come organizationally. They're not just necessarily personal, but they might be. But so you brief everybody on what they are. Here's what we're going to try to accomplish this year. Here's what goals are. Here's what expectations are. What do you need to be successful in your role? Because I would tell my team, each of you are experts. My CFO, my CHRO, my head of business development. You are experts in your field. That's why you're here. I am not an expert in your field, and I don't intend to become one. So what do you need from me to help you be successful in your job? And that's maybe a little bit of coaching. Maybe that's some support. That might be some education, so being a sounding board. It might be different things. But so get your folks on board with the concept first that they are the expert and you're looking to them to do their role, to perform their role in the team, right? And I'll tell you, in the military, you learn very quickly, and in business, it is all about the team, right? Everybody has to work together. We're not going to cross over. And again, in smaller businesses, smaller organizations, you may wear multiple hats, yes, but there's still a team that needs to work together to accomplish things. So that's the first step is treat them like a team, get them to work as a team, do some team building things, get outside the office and do some stuff that people get to know each other a little bit better because you're relying on them to work together to succeed. I'll give you one great example to your question, Shelley. So it was September of this particular year, and the team were doing a review, and the team came to me and they said, "Brian, we're going to miss cash flow by $30 million." And I said, "Really?" And they said, "Yeah, that's this. We're not. Collections are bad, inventory's high, and it's just not looking good at all. And so we're going to miss by 30 million." I said, "Okay, well, it's September." They said, "Yeah, yeah." I said, "Okay, well, we still have some time left. So what are we going to do differently to change that outcome?" "Oh, I don't know, but we don't think we can get there." I said, "I tell you what." I said, "The answer is no. We're not going to miss by 30 million. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back in the room you just came out of, and I want you to put together a plan of what you could do. What would it take to recover the $30 million, right?" So they went back in the room. They came out about an hour later. They said, "Okay, we got a plan." I said, "All right, tell me the plan." So they went through the plan. "We're going to do this. We're going to do that." And I said, "Okay, great." I said, "Tell you what, let's implement your plan. Let's review it once a week to start with, just to see how it's going, and then we'll see where we end up." Okay. But I told them, let's implement your plan. Okay. Now, did I have a different plan in my mind? Maybe. Would I have suggested some other things? Maybe. But they needed to own their plan, and that team at that level has to work as a team, and they have to own their piece of the plan. They can't be my plan. And I told them, this isn't my plan. This is your plan. The other thing I said before we left the discussion was I said, "But one question, why is it do you think that I'm here? Like, what do you think my job is?" Because one thing it isn't is to tell you what you already know, which is why in the world did you come out here and tell me you're going to miss by 30 million in September when you know we can't? Well, I'm going to tell the chairman that. That's not what do you really? That's what you thought? Well, no. I said, "Okay. So let's focus on the problem and do something different as opposed to go cry about we're not going to get there." Long story short, we didn't lose 30 million. We actually beat the plan by 10 million. So we made up the 30 and got 10 more. Not because of anything I did, but because the team owned the plan and they implemented the plan. And I was just there and did I ask a few questions and review and challenge? Sure. but I wanted him to own it. And that was a great opportunity. And they came together as a group and worked together and they solved it. So
Wow,
that's how I did it.
you were the coach on the bench, Brian. You didn't suit up for and get on the ice.
It did not. In fact, they at one point they said the Israelis aren't paying. I said, well, sometimes they do that. I said, who's going there? They said, what do you mean? I said, well, who's going to Israel to talk to them? Because that's the way they operate. And if you go there, they'll give you money. You mean we have to go? I said, yeah, I'm not going. So one of you needs to go. And they went there. They got some money. So
That's fantastic. I love this. Brian, we need about 3 more hours today, I'll tell you. This is awesome. Um, yeah, so I want to skip to a question, Brian, that we ask everybody that comes into our program to talk with us, and that is, when you think about the lessons that you've learned about leadership, could you just give us one or two people, perhaps, that have been most influential for you, and perhaps one lesson that they taught you?
one comes to mind, and it's a bit of a funny story because a boss that I had when I first got out of the military, I worked at Michelin for the French, and a great company. And he could not have been more different than me. I mean, we were absolute opposites in personality and approach and all that. But what I learned from John, a dear friend of mine who passed away a few years ago, but was he taught me not to be so intense. So that's where some of the kinder, gentler stuff came from. Because he said, you're a big guy, you scare people, you got a deep voice, and he said, so you got to think about that. So just dial it back a little bit, because if you scare everybody, then they're not gonna do stuff. Um, he also taught me to focus on the team and less myself. He said, I don't want you solving all the problems, so I want to see how you can help the team solve the problems. But he also taught me to lead from the floor, not from my office or from the boardroom. So go out on the floor, go where they are, go where the problems are. In the Japanese word, we call that go to Gemba. But go to where it is. Don't nothing. Trust me, nothing ever got solved in a boardroom with PowerPoint. You got to go touch it and feel it and look at it and then make some decisions. So I learned a lot from the other side. He had no concept of time though. When we would travel together, he would be doing stuff. I'd go, John, the airplane's going to leave in like 2 minutes. Yeah, yeah, it's fine. They'll wait. He actually got him to bring an airplane back to the gate for us once. Anyway, but I learned a lot about the being different, and that helped me as I took on different roles.
I love it. You definitely have been a student. You have been. Okay, we want to open it up, but before we do, Brian, I want you to say a bit about Tee It Up for the Troops and what your role, a bit about the organization for those that don't know, and then what is your role now with them? What do you do?
Sure. So Tito for the Troops is a 501(c)(3) nonprofit in the United States that raises awareness and funds to help veterans and their families. We have 6 key areas we focus on: things like post-traumatic stress, suicide prevention, homelessness, education and caregiver support, and sports rehabilitation. We're teed up for the troops by our name. We run golf events all around the country to raise money that we then partner with and invest in other organizations to help provide veterans. We also run a program that Kevin referred to called Reunion, where we bring battle buddies together to reunite after potentially we had some Vietnam veterans this year who hadn't seen each other in 50 years. And so it's a great experience and provide some programming to help them. The key thing with veterans, there's so many folks have come back. And I'll give you a statistic, not to be Debbie Downer here, but in the global war on terror, the United States had over 7,000 soldiers and airmen and seamen killed in the conflict itself. Since that time, over 65,000 that have returned safely have taken their own lives. And it's because of the trauma and the things that they experience. So our job is that until that number is zero, it's about 22 a day, sadly, still. We're going to keep doing what we do. My job there is I'm responsible for operations, so I work with the team and the thousands of volunteers that we have. Our staff is only 6 people. 4 of us are full-time, 2 are part-time. We did 54 events last year around the country, so most of it's volunteers. And the clubs that we work with and the teams at the clubs that help us and work with us and support us are just phenomenal out in all the different places that we go. And so we work closely with those folks and with the volunteers and do the best we can to raise as much money so we can help every single veteran that we can.
Wow, some of those numbers are just staggering. Thank you, Brian. And again, I wish we had more time. I want to open it up, and I know that there are people on the call who would love to ask you a question. or maybe you have a comment, everyone, but let's open it up. Would you be okay with that, Brian?
Absolutely.
Okay, so everyone, you can hover over the bottom on the reaction area there, and you will see a hand, and you can just raise your hand, and we would love to hear your question for Brian. So, Kevin, I will change my view. And actually, Kevin, you know what? Since your view is like that, I'll have you just let us know, but I should see a hand come up. So,
Okay,
who
terrific.
has the first
Well, this is our
question?
chance
Mhm.
to there. Oh, Casey from California, you go, girl.
Hi, Brian. Thank you so much for being with us today. I found your story super fascinating, and I'm kind of one of the younger leaders, I think, in this program. And so, one of the things I wanted to ask you are, what are some of the personal habits or routines that you followed that kind of helped give you your foundation for your leadership standards?
Casey, thank you for the question and thanks for being here. I've always been sort of a time person and I find myself maybe a little bit, I don't know, OCD with it in that I'm an early riser. I get up, even when I don't want to, I get up anyway. And I always did that, but certainly in the military. And then after that, get there early, get started. And then also I lived and died by my calendar and my schedule, and I was like my assistant was the gatekeeper. That and I would block out time for walk-ins, but if I had an appointment, we started on time, we ended on time, we stuck to it, and I held my team to that standard. And so if somebody came in and just said, "Hey, can I get a minute?" The answer was no, unless it was the open time. You got to get an appointment. So I really managed that closely because I had a lot of people asking for time, and you get pulled a lot of different directions, and if you get distracted, one of the other things that I would do, and this served me so well, is when I would come in the office, I would get there early, have a little bit of quiet time, and I would ask myself, where can I make the biggest impact in this organization today? And I'd look at all the stuff I had to do. I'd look at all the appointments and all the meetings and all the things that people wanted or I needed. But I'd say, is that the most important thing I need to do today? Because as the leader, depending on where you are in the hierarchy of organization, you know if you don't do it, it doesn't get done, or your boss may have to step in and do it, and that's never good, right? Even if they want to, that's never good. Kind of like the coach running out on the ice or whatever. But so I'd ask myself that question. I always challenge leaders, and especially in the academy that we had, is ask yourself that question because a lot of times we get, the old the tyranny of the urgent kind of a deal
Mhm.
instead of the important or the thing you can make the biggest impact on. It might be something as simple as decision. It might be something as simple as a question. But what's the thing you can do to make the biggest impact? Because if you're caught up in a bunch of stuff and you're missing the bigger things, you need that moment maybe of reflection to sit back and just make sure you're focused on the right things.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much, Brian.
Casey. Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Hey, this is your chance to ask a question. When you hang out with cool people that have a lot to give, don't be afraid to ask and get all you can from them. So who's next? Maybe a general manager of a club or someone who's going to put their hand up. Oh, we have one right there. Michael, go ahead.
Uh, Thank you, Brian. I missed it was a Japanese term of taking an objective and lowering it down to every line level employee. What was that?
Yeah, the Japanese term is called Hoshin, Hoshin, Hoshin planning. Um, Americanized it called policy deployment, but it's effectively put together a plan and push it down to every single person in the organization, and not like MBO, like the old days of management by objectives, right? Where we thought if I just give you an objective, you'll do it. You have to talk to people about it. You don't just give them their list and say go do. In fact, you want their input on it, but make sure they understand by doing this. Here's how it helps us do that. And even though your role at a club, let's say, might be I'll pick one, the bag drop person. Okay. And while that doesn't necessarily help us, you may say, well, does that help us get new members? Maybe. Does it help us keep members? Absolutely. Right. And how you interact, what you do, what you say, how they feel, welcoming them, all that stuff, that's an important role. You're the first person they see usually. So, as an example, help them understand it. Again, the why am I asking you to do this? Because here's how it helps the organization succeed. Does that help?
Yep. Thank you.
Michael. Okay, who's next? Let's get a few people on the in the queue of people. Please put up your hand and take your chance. Oh, go ahead, Ron. Please let's other people start to put up your hand so we can keep this efficient. Go ahead, Ron.
Oh, you're muted, Ron. I can see your little mute there. There
Thanks,
you
Brian.
go.
Just really quickly, love the story about where you step back and held your folks accountable to come up with a solution. Have you always been able to lead from that place, or where there was a moment when you were the guy making things happen, and then there was something happened that allowed you to make that shift and take that step back and take the risk, so to speak, of those results through your
Great,
team?
great question, Ron. The answer is heck no. I wasn't always like that. I was like everybody where I would dive in there. And in fact, there was a significant event that occurred. So I was running a business for the organization, and it was about $150 million in size and had several facilities around the world. And they asked me to take over a troubled business, actually, that we had a facility in Toronto, and it was in Cleveland, Ohio. And so I spent a lot of time in Toronto, and it was $800 million in size. So I went from 150 million to 800 million. And when I got to the office and I started looking at the organization, looking at the challenges, looking at the issues, this fear came over me of, holy smokes, how am I going to do this? Because it was so big. And there were so many different things going on. And so that's when it hit me. Okay, I need my team to help me, because if I try to do this myself, I'll be overwhelmed. B, I'll probably, have some sort of a medical issue. So that was the awakening, where there's no way I can run this on my own. And so I changed some of my team members out, unfortunately, because that was part of the reason we were struggling. But in the end, we put a great team together. We turned that baby around, and mentioned I had to brief Alan about our delivery. When I took over, every program we had was late. When I left, every program we had was on time. Not because of me, because of the team.
Thank you.
Great question.
2 minutes left, so let's get one or two hands up quickly. This is your chance. You're hanging out with Brian. Okay, Rick from Memphis.
Hey, Brian, quick question. So when you're interviewing somebody for your team as a direct report, what are some of the things that you're looking for? Maybe a favorite question. What are you gauging, and what's a good indicator that they'll be a good fit for your team?
Great question, Rick. By the way, I had a facility in Memphis and a lot of time there. One of my favorite places. Great barbecue. But anyway, sorry, I digress. The first thing would be is I would say, we're looking for someone in this role. Tell me why you are the best person that I could find to do that role. Because remember, each of the people on my team is an expert in their area, and I want them to tell me why should I hire you, but not say it that way. But tell me why you're one of the best out there, or the best that I could find, because that's what I need. We're looking for the best and the brightest in your space. So I would ask those kind of questions. But the other thing I would do, and this is maybe sound like a weird question, but I did this once with my team, and it was actually pretty impactful. I said, let's say that you join the team and you're doing your thing, and all of a sudden we're going to go out and we're going to do a big acquisition, because we were acquiring a lot. We were looking at a lot of properties, and I said, and I need you to be the lead on that acquisition team to look at their market presence and so forth, whatever it was. Okay. If you had to leave your post for, let's say, 90 days to go do that acquisition, would your team be ready to take over for you? And what would that look like? And because as much as I wanted an expert in their field, I also wanted somebody who was going to prepare their team to lead and not be a run around, do it yourself kind of person. Because it depends on where, my staff level was fairly high level, and they had a lot of stuff. And again, they weren't really doers, they were leaders. So a couple of questions like that to get a sense of where they were thinking. And I might also ask a question like at my cash flow question. Hey, find yourself in this situation, how would you handle it? And see how they'd answer.
Oh, great question, Rick, and thank you, Brian. We are at the top of the hour, Brian, and we just can't thank you enough for what you just gave us here today. I think everybody's been moved by that. And is there a way to get in touch with you, or is that a thing that people could do if they wanted to ask you another question or get and just learn from you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you guys certainly can email me. I don't know if you guys sent that out with the invite. I can tell you what it is, but you might spell it wrong because it's Brian at teeitupforthetroops.org. So just like it sounds, T-E-E it up for the troops.org. Sorry, it's so long. So B-R-I-A-N, not Y, B-R-I-A-N at teeitupforthetroops.org. Feel free to email me, and I will be happy to answer your questions.
Shelley,
And by the
last
way, it's been a
words?
pleasure.
Oh, thank you. Shelley.
Oh, that was a master class on standards and leadership. And as I said, Kevin, I think, gosh, 3 hours wouldn't even be enough. So, Brian, on behalf of everyone in our program and our guests today, and Kevin and myself, thank you so much for this gift of you today. It was extraordinary, and we can hardly wait. We'd love to, if you're willing, someday bring you back if you're interested. So,
I would love to come back, and thank you everybody for attending. I'll leave you with a quote. This was actually from the 1940s out of the UK. It was a British military officer, and he said, leadership is the hardest thing that you will do, but the most rewarding. Be the best leader you can be. That was like a long time ago. So there's nothing new here.
Right.
Oh,
Right.
thank you so much. Brilliant. What a great way to finish it. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Special guests, if you want to get a hold of Kevin and I, please do. From that invite, we'd love to tell you more about our program. Brian, have a wonderful rest of your day. We wish the best of luck to your new grandchild whenever that happens.
Whenever that happens.
And we can hardly wait to connect with you again. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you so much, guys.
Bye
Take
for
care.
now, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.